Do you really think that the conquerors of the Wild West enjoyed juicy steaks and fresh bread every evening? For decades, cinema has created a beautiful picture where tables were laden with food and saloons were always full of roasted meat and whiskey. The reality faced by settlers was much harsher, grayer, and hungrier than any screenwriter's fiction. For thousands of people who ventured west, every meal became a difficult task of finding at least some calories. Food was not a source of pleasure, but the only fuel that kept them from collapsing on the rocky trail. Behind the beautiful landscapes of the prairies lay a constant struggle with scurvy, exhaustion, and poisoning from poor quality food. Watch the video to the end to find out how people managed to make festive desserts with only vinegar and stale breadcrumbs at their disposal. What if I told you that everything you believed about the rich lands of the West was shattered by the harsh reality of the first hungry year? When flour supplies ran low and the nearest trading post was hundreds of miles away, settlers had to show miracles of ingenuity bordering on madness. Wheat flour on the frontier was a luxury reserved for special occasions or for sick family members. In everyday life, it was replaced by any available substance that could be ground into powder. People collected tree bark, dried it in the sun, and ground it into coarse dust with stones. Such flour had no nutritional value, but it allowed them to trick their stomachs, creating the illusion of fullness for a few hours. They used dried roots of local plants, which were often bitter or caused indigestion. Some tribes and trappers who adopted their practices even used certain types of fatty clay. This clay was mixed with water and baked on hot stones to produce heavy, earthy cakes. They weighed heavily on the stomach, but dulled the agonizing feeling of hunger that drove people mad. Eating such substitutes required tremendous willpower, as the taste was disgusting and the texture resembled sand. The settlers' teeth quickly wore down from constantly chewing coarse fibers and abrasive particles. Such a diet often led to serious intestinal problems, but people simply had no choice. Death from exhaustion was a much more real threat than the prospect of ruining one's teeth or stomach. In the most difficult times, when snowstorms locked people in their huts, they began to cook products made from rawhide. Belts, horse harness parts, and even old moccasins were cut into small pieces and boiled for hours. The leather softened, turning into a sticky, tasteless mass that was difficult to swallow. It was chewing for survival, a mechanical process of obtaining a meager amount of protein. History knows of cases when people boiled and ate even candle wax mixed with sawdust. It was an extreme measure, an attempt to fill the void inside with at least something material. Such meals took place in complete silence, broken only by the sounds of the wind behind the thin walls of the dwelling. Each bite was swallowed with difficulty, but gave hope to live another day. The psychological pressure from such nutrition was enormous, because food ceased to be a source of joy. It turned into a hated necessity, reminding people of the precariousness of human existence. People dreamed of a simple piece of white bread as the greatest treasure in the world. And when the first greens appeared in the spring, they seemed sweeter to them than any honey. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about people's ability to adapt to such conditions for the sake of a faint hope for a better life? Write about it in the comments and be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Are you ready to learn the truth about what cowboys really drank around the campfire at night? Coffee was the main drink of the Wild West, a symbol of civilization and the only stimulant available. However, real coffee beans were expensive and ran out first on long journeys. But the habit of starting the morning with a hot black liquid was so strong that people were not willing to give it up. Thus, a whole culture of coffee substitutes was born, which only vaguely resembled the original. The most popular substitute was chicory, which could be found in the wild or grown in the garden. Its roots were dug up, washed, cut into pieces, and roasted for a long time until they turned dark brown. When brewed, it produced a bitter, dark infusion that looked like coffee. The taste was distinctive and earthy, but a hot mug in your hands gave a feeling of comfort. When chicory was not available, acorns were used, which were collected in oak groves in the fall. Acorns required lengthy processing to remove tannins and bitterness. They were soaked, dried, roasted, and ground to produce a powder with a nutty aroma. This drink was even nutritious, but of course it did not contain a single gram of caffeine. The poorest families used burnt bread crusts or barley grains. The bread was deliberately overcooked in the oven until it turned to charcoal, and then boiling water was poured over it. The result was a cloudy, bitter water with a burnt smell, which was called coffee only out of politeness. It was self-deception, an attempt to preserve the ritual when the substance was lost. Some used okra seeds or even roasted dandelion roots. Each region had its own recipes dictated by the local flora and the degree of need. Travelers often carried strange mixtures with them, passing them off as a special variety of coffee. Real coffee, if there was any, was brewed incredibly strong to stretch the effect for longer. It was called Arbuckles after a popular brand, but often it was just black sludge. A pinch of salt or even eggshells were often added to this liquid to settle the sediment. There was usually no sugar, so the drink was black and bitter. It warmed the insides on cold mornings and helped wake people up before a hard day. The lack of caffeine led to constant lethargy and headaches for those who were accustomed to it in the East. People suffered from withdrawal symptoms, becoming irritable and sullen. Hot water colored by burnt beans was a small consolation. But even such a drink was better than just cold water from a stream. This obsession with coffee shows how important familiar rituals were for maintaining sanity. A mug of coffee was an anchor that kept a person in the world of normality in the midst of the wilderness. Without this morning ritual, the day seemed endless and hopeless. Could you start your day with a drink made from burnt crackers instead of aromatic espresso? How difficult do you think it would be for a modern person to give up caffeine? Watch the video to find out what was boiling in the settlers' pots day and night. Want to know a secret that will forever change your perception of hygiene and cooking in the past? Many people think that people used to simply cook food over a fire, but the reality was much stranger. In the homes of many settlers and at hunting campsites, there was one unique dish. It was not cooked for hours, but continuously for many months, and sometimes throughout the long winter. It was called eternal stew or soup, and the name was not a metaphor at all. A huge cast iron pot with this concoction was never taken off the fire, and worst of all for us, was never washed. The principle of keeping this dish alive was ingeniously simple. The amount of food that the family ate during the day was replenished in the evening with new ingredients, which were thrown into the same broth. Absolutely everything that the men and women managed to obtain during the daylight hours went into this bottomless pot. It could be a piece of tough buffalo meat, a rabbit or squirrel caught by chance, a handful of dried beans, leftover grains, or edible roots found in the forest also went in. The ingredients were thrown into the boiling liquid haphazardly without any order, proportions, or recipe. No one thought about the compatibility of flavors when the main task was simply to fill their stomachs. The cook relied only on luck and the availability of at least some food in the house. The taste of this dish constantly changed, drifting smoothly from meat to vegetables and back again, depending on the catch. It was a real culinary lottery, the outcome of which was impossible to predict. In one spoonful, the eater might find a piece of fresh, juicy venison hunted that morning. In another spoonful, there might be a potato boiled to mush, thrown in 2 weeks ago. The main purpose of this strange cooking method was to save fuel and precious time. There was never enough firewood, and chopping it in the cold was hard, exhausting work. It was too wasteful to light a new fire every time they cooked. Therefore, the coals under the cauldron were kept smoldering constantly around the clock, preventing the stew from cooling down. The boiling liquid in the cauldron served as an excellent preservative, as the constant high temperature killed bacteria. However, this stew often looked extremely unappetizing and frightening. Usually it was a gray, thick mass of indeterminate color, bubbling in the darkness of the hearth. The eternal stew often included parts of the carcass that we would now throw to the dogs without hesitation. Cartilage, tendons, tough skin, tubular bones, all of this was boiled for hours and days. The goal was for these scraps to give the broth their last drops of nutrients and gelatin. Coarse flour, if available, was often used as a thickener for such a soup. In harsher conditions, even animal blood was used if the slaughter had taken place recently. The result was a very filling, incredibly fatty, and heavy dish. It sat like a stone in the stomach but provided energy for working in the cold. The settlers sincerely believed that the longer the stew was cooked, the more nutritious, rich, and tasty it was. Over time, the old ingredients completely broke down into fibers, creating a thick, nutritious base for new products. This created a continuous cycle of nutrition, linking the past and the future. The cauldron was a symbol of stability and hope in the pioneer's home. People knew that as long as the cauldron was boiling on the hearth, the family would not starve that winter. The thick, heavy smell of the brew permeated absolutely everything around it. It permeated people's clothes, hair, and even the log walls of the dwelling itself. However, this primitive method of cooking also had hidden dangers that few people thought about at the time. The system only worked as long as the cauldron was constantly boiling or simmering. If the fire went out and the cauldron cooled down, it instantly became an ideal breeding ground for bacteria. For casual travelers who stopped by the house for the night, a plate of such stew was the main sign of hospitality. Guests were served a portion from the common pot, demonstrating openness and a desire to help. It was categorically impossible to refuse the treat, even if the contents of the pot looked suspicious. Refusal could be taken as a mortal insult and disrespect to the hosts. It was a kind of act of trust and acceptance of a stranger into their narrow circle of survival. A shared meal from one dirty pot united people on the frontier more strongly than any oath. In this way, people shared not only food, but also their microflora, becoming closer to each other. Like this video if you are sincerely glad that today we have refrigerators and the opportunity to cook fresh food every day. Guess how long it took to create this immortal cookie? One of the most common foods on the frontier, especially on the road, was biscuits, known as hardtack or sea biscuits. It was a simple mixture of flour, water, and sometimes salt, baked to the consistency of a brick. The main advantage of galettes was not their taste, but their incredible ability to be stored for years without spoiling. These crackers were so hard that it was impossible to bite into them without risking breaking a tooth. Before eating, they had to be broken with a revolver handle or a hammer. They were often soaked in coffee, water, or fat to soften them up a bit. When dry, they were tasteless, dry, and resembled plaster. Hardtack was the perfect emergency food, as it did not mold or rot. However, it had one terrible enemy that even the most airtight containers could not cope with. Weevils and worms often got inside the biscuits, turning them into living hives. Experienced travelers had their own ways of dealing with this scourge without throwing away the valuable product. They would throw the biscuits into hot coffee and simply skim off the insects that floated to the surface with a spoon. Others preferred to eat in the dark so they wouldn't see what they were putting in their mouths. It was believed that insects were just extra meat. Sometimes the biscuits were fried in lard, which made them a little more edible and caloric. This dish was called hellfire because of the toughness and often rancid taste of the fat. But on the long journey across the prairies, where there was neither game nor shops, these crackers saved lives. Fort soldiers and cowboys on the trail hated hardtack, giving it derogatory nicknames like sheet iron. But they always kept a couple of these stones in their saddlebags in case of unexpected delays. It was a strategic reserve, a guarantee that death from starvation would not come suddenly. The taste of the biscuits was the taste of the road itself. Dusty, dry, and endless. It reminded them of home, where bread was soft and warm, causing bouts of nostalgia. But on the frontier, sentimentality was an unaffordable luxury. People gnawed on their stones and moved on. Manufacturers tried to make them as cheap as possible, often using low-quality flour. Sometimes chalk or bone meal was added to the dough for weight and whiteness. This made an already inedible product a real challenge for digestion. But there was no one to complain to. Have you ever tried real army biscuits or crackers? How long do you think a person can live on such a diet without harming their health? In the next chapter, you will learn what living substance was valued more by gold miners than gold itself. In the Wild West, especially among gold miners and lone trappers, there was a cult of sourdough. The yeast we are used to today was unavailable, so bread was baked from fermented dough. This sourdough was a living organism that required constant care, warmth, and feeding. Losing sourdough was considered a real tragedy, comparable to losing a horse or a weapon. Sourdough was made from flour and water, leaving the mixture to ferment in a warm place, catching wild yeast from the air. The result was a bubbling, sour-smelling mass that raised the dough. The taste of such bread was distinctive, with a distinct sourness, for which the miners were even nicknamed sourdough. The pot with the starter was guarded more closely than the eye could see, especially on cold winter nights. Legends say that in severe frosts, the settlers took the container with the dough to bed with them, warming it with their own body heat. If the culture froze and died, it was difficult and time-consuming to restore it. Every time bread was baked, part of the dough was always left to be fed with flour and water for the next time. Some sourdough starters lived for years and decades, passed down from father to son. It was believed that old sourdough made tastier and fluffier bread. The smell of fermenting dough was distinctive and not always pleasant in a confined space. But for frontier people, it was the smell of life and satiety. This dough was used not only to make bread, but also pancakes and fritters, which were the main breakfast. In conditions of a shortage of baking soda and baking powder, sourdough was the only way to make baked goods soft. Flatbread made with water quickly became boring and was difficult to digest. Sourdough bread was the pinnacle of culinary art in the field. Even on the road, shaking in a van or saddlebag, the jar of sourdough traveled with its owner. It required regular attention. It had to be walked by opening the lid and stirring it. This created a strange emotional attachment to the pot of dough. Losing the starter as a result of accidentally dropping the pot was a cause for serious quarrels or depression. A neighbor who had lost his starter could come and ask a more fortunate comrade for a start. It was considered bad form to refuse such a request. In the absence of women and home comforts, caring for the starter became a substitute for a family hearth. It was something alive, growing, and providing sustenance, dependent on humans. In a world of destruction and resource extraction, it was an act of creation. Today, sourdough bread has become a fashionable trend, but back then, it was a harsh necessity. Without this sour, sticky lump, life at the gold mine would have been even more unbearable. Are you ready for the shocking truth about how meat could be stored for years without refrigerators or preservatives? In those days, food preservation was a matter of life and death, and mistakes were costly. The Native Americans of the Great Plains taught the white pioneers how to make pemmican, an ideal and completely unique product for survival. It was a true concentrate of pure energy, capable of sustaining a person's strength with a minimum amount of food. However, the process of making it was long, incredibly laborious, and required strict adherence to ancient technology. Any violation of the rules could lead to the spoilage of supplies and people dying of hunger. Only the best fresh bison, deer, or elk meat was used as a base. The flesh was carefully separated from the bones and cut into very thin, long strips. These strips were then dried under the scorching sun or over the smoke of a fire until they became completely brittle. The meat became hard as wood and dark in color. Not a single drop of moisture was allowed to remain in the product, otherwise it could rot from the inside. After drying, these hard pieces were ground into a fine powder with large stones. The result was a substance more reminiscent of coarse meat flour than food. This dry meat powder was then mixed with melted hot internal fat. The proportions were always strictly 1-to-1 by weight. Fat played a dual role in this recipe, being a key element. It served as a reliable preservative, sealing the meat and a source of tremendous energy. In cold climates, it was the fat that provided calories to warm the body from within. To improve the taste and add nutritional value, dried forest berries were often added to the mixture. Usually, sour cranberries, blueberries, cherries, or erga berries were used. Berries were the only source of vitamins and saved people from scurvy in winter. The resulting thick mass was tightly packed into special leather bags made from bison hides. Another layer of fat was poured on top to ensure complete airtightness and remove all air. In this form, pemmican could be stored for several years without losing any of its nutritional properties. Some historical sources claim that it remained edible even after decades. This product was not affected by summer heat, winter frost, or high humidity. It was the ideal canned food, created by nature itself and human ingenuity. The taste of pemmican was, to put it mildly, specific and unusual for Europeans. It was a strange mixture of salty, heavy fat, dry meat fibers, and sour berries. To the untrained palate, it could seem disgusting and hard on the stomach. But for a hungry traveler in the icy wilderness, it was a real delicacy and a lifesaver. It could be eaten dry on the go, like modern protein bars. It was also used to make a thick soup by adding flour and water, if it was possible to build a fire. This concoction was called rhubarba, and it warmed you up instantly. Even a small piece of this fatty product gave a feeling of satiety for half a day of hard work. It was absolutely indispensable in military raids and long foot marches. Its main advantage was that it could be eaten secretly without lighting a fire. This allowed them to remain undetected by enemies, as there was no smoke from the fire. Warriors and hunters could live on pemmican alone for days, while maintaining their combat readiness and strength. It was the first military field kitchen in history that could fit in your pocket. However, mass production of pemmican required the killing of huge numbers of animals. Entire herds of bison were destroyed to produce industrial quantities, which undermined the ecosystem. Europeans put this artisanal production on a mass scale, depriving the Indians of their traditional food source. This became one of the main causes of bloody conflicts on the plains. It was this unpalatable product that allowed people to settle in the most inaccessible and coldest corners of the continent. Without bags of pemmican, the map of America would look completely different today. Would you risk trying meat that was cooked 3 years ago and stored in a leather bag? How do you think it would affect your health and digestion? In the next chapter, you will learn the secret of making apple pie without a single apple. Is it possible to bake a real apple pie if you haven't seen a fresh apple in 6 months? In the harsh Wild West, the desserts we are accustomed to were an unaffordable luxury that one could only dream of. Fresh fruit was completely unavailable in those parts for most of the year due to the climate and logistics. Delivering canned peaches or pears cost a fortune, which the settlers simply did not have. However, the natural human need for sweets and the desire to celebrate were stronger than any deprivation. Housewives understood that without small joys, harsh life would become unbearable, and began to invent incredible recipes. One of these recognized masterpieces of culinary imitation was the famous vinegar pie. Today, this name may cause confusion or even disgust, but back then, it was a delicacy. The taste of this pie was surprisingly reminiscent of lemon, even though there were no lemons in it at all. It was a trick based on the chemical reaction of simple ingredients. The filling was made from the most basic ingredients that could be found in any pantry. These were sugar, water, eggs, if the chickens were laying, a little flour, and of course, ordinary vinegar. Vinegar, most often apple cider vinegar, played the main role, giving the cloyingly sweet mixture the necessary sourness and fruity note. When the proportions were correct and the baking was slow, an amazing transformation took place. This strange liquid mixture thickened in the oven and acquired the delicate texture of real custard. Anyone who tasted this pie with their eyes closed would have sworn they were eating an exquisite lemon dessert. Another true miracle of human ingenuity was the fake apple pie. In this dish, the role of juicy apples was successfully played by ordinary softened crackers made from unleavened dough. The dry cookies were broken into pieces and boiled in sugar syrup. Tartaric acid was added to the syrup for sourness, along with rare spices that were guarded like the apple of one's eye. Cinnamon and nutmeg worked their magic, deceiving the taste buds. Surprisingly, the texture and taste of the crackers, swollen in syrup, were almost indistinguishable from baked apples. These pies were not just food, they were a symbol of the triumph of the human spirit over material poverty. A woman who was able to create a semblance of a rich, festive table from literally nothing was held in high esteem in the community. It was considered the highest level of housekeeping and a sign of a good hostess. It was a desperate attempt to preserve the traditions of the civilized world and create comfort in a damp dugout in the middle of the bare steppe. Sugar was also a very expensive luxury, and it often had to be economized. Therefore, sweet sand was often replaced with thick sorghum molasses or wild honey. The molasses, dark and viscous, gave the pastries a very specific, slightly burnt and bitter taste. It turned the dough dark brown, but the children were delighted with this treat. They happily licked the sweet, sticky drops from their fingers, not noticing the bitterness. Sometimes green tomatoes were used to make so-called fruit fillings. They were boiled for a long time in sugar or honey until they became transparent candied fruits. During the cooking process, the vegetable taste disappeared, giving way to sweetness and a texture similar to figs. Spices played a key role in such recipes, skillfully masking the absence of the main ingredients. The aroma of cinnamon and cloves was a powerful tool capable of deceiving the brain. Inhaling this scent, a person began to believe in the presence of apples or pears, even if they were eating tomatoes. Such complex desserts were only prepared on major holidays, such as Christmas or children's birthdays. People tried to recapture, if only for a moment, the feeling of a normal, well-fed life that they had left behind in the East. It was a powerful psychological anchor for the whole family. The pie on the table was a reminder that life was not only about hard, exhausting work and fighting the cold. The sweetness on the tongue gave hope that tomorrow would be better. It helped people not to go crazy from the monotony of everyday life. The dough for the cake was often made with melted pork fat, as butter was often unavailable in winter. This dough turned out to be very flaky and crumbly, but had a characteristic animal flavor of lard. This flavor became an integral part of the culinary memory of an entire generation of pioneers. The recipes for these unique pies of despair were carefully recorded in family cookbooks. They were passed down to daughters and granddaughters as a treasure as valuable as the Bible. They taught young girls not so much cooking as the important skill of not giving up in the face of adversity. Mothers taught their children that even in the darkest and hungriest times, there should be room for joy on the table. These strange dishes prove that human imagination knows no bounds when it comes to survival and comfort. The ability to make candy out of nothing was a vital skill on the frontier. Could you tell the difference between a soaked cracker and a real apple if it were generously seasoned with cinnamon? And would you dare to serve your guests a pie made with vinegar instead of lemon? If the Wild West had an official flavor, it would undoubtedly be that of coarse ground cornmeal. Wheat was a capricious crop in those days, often perishing in the harsh climate of the plains. Corn, on the other hand, was cheaper, less demanding, and much easier to store for long periods of time. Therefore, for the vast majority of poor settlers and farmers, corn became the king of the table. Corn porridge, simply called mash or samp, became the staple food for generations for many years. It was eaten for breakfast, then reheated for lunch, and the leftovers were eaten for dinner. Only the consistency of the dish and the degree of hunger of the eaters changed, but the taste remained the same. It was the fuel on which America was built, even though the fuel itself was of poor quality. Most often, porridge was cooked in plain water, as fresh milk was a rarity and a luxury. Cows were thin, and milk was saved for children or for sale. As a result, the porridge turned out thick, viscous, with unpleasant lumps of flour. If there was no salt in the house, which happened often, the food became completely bland and tasteless. To diversify this dreary menu in some way, housewives came up with a clever way of serving it. The porridge, which had cooled overnight and turned into a dense brick, was cut into thick slices. These slices were then fried in boiling lard in a pan until crispy. This fried porridge was considered a real delicacy and was called fried mash. The same cornmeal and water were used to bake the most primitive types of bread, known as corn dodgers or hoe cakes. The names spoke for themselves. Hoe cake literally meant a flatbread on a hoe. Workers often baked them right in the field, using the blade of a hoe or shovel as a frying pan over a fire. Sometimes the dough was simply slapped onto a hot flat stone. These cakes were far from the delicious baked goods we are used to today. They were hard as rock, dry, and often badly burnt on the outside. At the same time, the dough often remained raw and sticky on the inside. It was only possible to swallow such a piece by washing it down with plenty of water or weak coffee. The monotonous and meager corn diet led to serious and dangerous health problems. People suffered en masse from pellagra, a terrible disease caused by an acute deficiency of B vitamins. The pioneers did not know that corn blocks the absorption of certain substances if it is not treated with lime. But no one associated their ailments with their favorite and only porridge. The symptoms of this disease were constant weakness, terrible skin rashes, and ulcers. In advanced cases, mental disorders began, and people literally went mad. People thought it was an infection or a curse, but the cause was on their plate. It was a tragedy of ignorance that claimed thousands of lives. Corn filled the stomach well, giving a heavy and long-lasting feeling of fullness. However, it did not provide enough energy for the exhausting hard work on the farm. People had to eat huge portions of this empty food to get at least some calories. The stomachs of children and adults swelled from the volume of food, but the body remained weak and flabby. Sometimes on good days, small pieces of overcooked bacon were added to the porridge. If possible, dark molasses or maple syrup was added for sweetness. This made the food more tolerable and allowed another spoonful to be swallowed. But even with these additions, it remained the coarse food of the poor. It was food for survival only, offering no gastronomic pleasure. Eating was a mechanical process of fueling up, devoid of pleasure. People ate so they wouldn't collapse in the furrows they were plowing. Farmers grew corn themselves, and it was the corn harvest that determined whether a family would survive the coming winter. A summer drought or a sudden invasion of locusts effectively meant a death sentence by starvation. Sacks of dry grain stood in the corner of the hut as the family's main treasure. They were guarded more carefully than money because gold cannot be eaten. Even wealthy ranchers and cowboys on long trips often ate the same corn. Grain and flour were easy to transport in sacks and took up little space. Corn did not spoil in the heat as quickly as dried meat or vegetables. A sack of coarse flour was a must-have item in any settler's wagon. Many frontier settlers carried a fierce hatred for the taste of corn porridge throughout their lives. Having subsequently become wealthy, the inhabitants of the Wild West often refused to even look at corn-based dishes. For them, this taste forever remained the taste of poverty, fear, and hopelessness. Only white wheat bread was served in their wealthy mansions. However, it was this golden grain that allowed America to populate its vast western territories. Without cheap, accessible, and unpretentious corn, large-scale colonization would have been physically impossible. Cities and states grew up on this tasteless porridge. Could you eat the same porridge without salt or sugar 3 times a day for a year? In a harsh world of hard physical labor and bitter cold, fat was valued far more than gold. The yellow metal could not be eaten to keep warm, but fat gave you a chance to live to see the morning. Calories were the only hard currency that people used to pay for their lives with nature. In this economic system, fat was the largest bill, which was guarded like the apple of one's eye. Pork fat, melted lard, bear or bison fat. All of these were strategic reserves for the family. Animal fat was carefully collected, melted down in huge vats, and stored in wooden barrels and clay pots. Losing a supply of lard due to spoilage or theft was a real tragedy, threatening starvation. Fat was used absolutely everywhere where food preparation was required. It was used to fry everything that could be fried, and it was added to dough for softness. It was spread thickly on bread instead of butter, creating a layer as thick as a finger. Such a sandwich with pure lard was considered a full meal for a child, giving them strength to grow. It was a highly efficient fuel that allowed the body to start its internal furnace. A simple dish called esop was considered a special and desirable treat. It was a hot mixture of melted fat with flour, and if you were very lucky, milk or meat juice. The result was a very thick, white or gray sauce that boiled in a frying pan. The whole family would dip pieces of bread or hard biscuits into this fatty, steaming mass. This dish was incredibly high in calories and allowed them to instantly regain their strength after exhausting work in the fields. The feeling of fullness after such a lunch lasted for many hours. In the absence of domestic pork, men went hunting for bears precisely for their thick layer of subcutaneous fat. The meat of the predator was tough, but the fat was valued at its weight in gold for its unique properties. Bear hunting was deadly dangerous, but the reward of a barrel of fat justified any risk. Bear fat was considered a practically healing balm with a wide range of effects. It was used not only for frying food, but also for treating festering wounds or burns. It was rubbed on the chest for severe colds and coughs, and ointments were made from it. It was also generously rubbed into leather shoes to keep them from getting wet in the snow. People literally craved fat and went crazy without it, feeling constantly weak. Lean meat was spoken of with undisguised contempt, calling it empty food. It filled the stomach, but did not give a feeling of deep satisfaction and warmth. Rabbits or deer, whose meat is practically devoid of fat, could lead to a dangerous disease. This phenomenon was called rabbit starvation or protein poisoning. It is a terrible condition in which a person eats a lot of meat, but continues to rapidly lose strength and dies of exhaustion. The body critically needs fats to absorb proteins. The butter we are accustomed to was an inaccessible luxury for most people on the frontier. It was incredibly difficult to preserve without ice and cold. It quickly went rancid and became poisonous. Therefore, salty, well-rendered lard was the undisputed king of any kitchen. Its heavy, distinctive smell permeated clothes, hair, and the walls of the house. Even vegetables, if they appeared on the table in season, were never eaten plain. They were always stewed for hours with the addition of a large piece of lard or pork rind. Simply boiled beans or cabbage were considered food for livestock, incapable of feeding a worker. Fat made the coarse fibers softer and more filling, pleasantly coating the stomach. A heavy jar of lard was the main indicator of a family's economic well-being. If the bottom of the pot began to show, quiet panic ensued in the house. Saving fat was a real art, which mothers taught their daughters from early childhood. Not a single precious drop of fat from the pan was to be wasted. The leftovers were carefully soaked up with bread or poured back into the common jar for the next cooking. Pouring out fat meant throwing away life. Today, such an extreme diet would horrify any modern nutritionist. But back then, high cholesterol and plaque in the arteries were a problem of the distant future. First, one had to manage to live to see that future without freezing to death or starving to death. And the only way to survive in those conditions was on pure fat. This historical passion for fatty and heavy foods has left an indelible mark on American cuisine. Traditional dishes from the southern and western states are still astonishingly high in calories. Everything that is deep fried and covered in thick meat gravy is an echo of those times. It is a memory of the days when every calorie counted. Scurvy was a silent and merciless killer that struck down the strongest men on the frontier faster than enemy bullets. This disease crept up unnoticed at the end of a long winter, when vegetable supplies were running low. Bleeding gums, loose and falling teeth, constant weakness, and unhealed wounds were the faithful companions of a meager winter diet. People felt life literally draining out of them, along with their strength. Instinctively, on an animal level, the settlers understood that it was vital for them to eat something fresh. As soon as the first snow melted, a real hunt for any greenery began. These unassuming plants were the first powerful sources of vitamins after months of eating salted meat and flour. It was often impossible to eat them raw because of their toughness or bitterness. Therefore, they were boiled in water to soften the fibers and remove the unpleasant taste. This green mass was eaten like spinach, often seasoned with vinegar or melted fat for satiety. The liquid remaining after cooking was not poured out, but drunk as a healing broth. This brew brought color back to the cheeks and stopped bleeding gums. A special and very dangerous place in the diet was occupied by lacunos, which Americans called pokeweed. This tall plant with large leaves is poisonous when raw and can kill a person. However, its young shoots contain a lot of useful substances if cooked properly. To neutralize the poison, the shoots of lacuna had to be boiled 3 times, each time draining the water and pouring in new water. It was a long process that required patience and firewood. A mistake in preparation or haste could cost the whole family their lives. But the need for fresh greens was so strong that it outweighed the fear of poisoning. People took the risk because the alternative was a painful death from scurvy. Lacanus became a cult plant of the poor, a symbol of spring rebirth. Women and children were the main expert gatherers in the family. While the men plowed the land, the female members of the family combed the surrounding meadows and forests. They knew every plant in the area by sight and knew exactly when and where to gather it. This invaluable knowledge about edible wild plants was often learned from the local Native Americans who had lived on this land for centuries. Much had to be learned through dangerous trial and error. Knowledge of botany was as important a survival skill as the ability to shoot. Wild onions and wild garlic were worth their weight in gold for their pungent taste and aroma. They could liven up the bland corn porridge that everyone had grown tired of over the winter. These plants were the first spices available to settlers in the wild wilderness. They were harvested for future use, dried for the winter by weaving the stems into long braids and hanging them from the ceiling. The smell of onions in the house was considered a sign of health and a reliable protection against disease. If the house smelled of garlic, it meant that scurvy would not come there. Berries were picked by the bucketful during the season, trying to stock up on vitamins for the year ahead. Blackberries, elderberries, wild plums, and everything else the forest had to offer were used. What they couldn't eat right away was dried in the sun or cooked with a minimal amount of sugar. The dried berries were then added to meat pemmican or holiday pies. Prickly pear cacti in the arid regions of the Southwest were another unexpected source of food. Their prickly fruits and flat, fleshy leaves, carefully cleaned of needles, were roasted or boiled. This required skill, as the tiny thorns could cause a lot of problems. Arrogantly ignoring such food sources often led to tragedy on expeditions. Groups that ate only the meat and bread they had brought with them died of disease more quickly. Those who did not disdain eating weeds and roots survived and retained their strength. Today, this unique knowledge has been almost completely lost due to lack of need. Back then, any 5-year-old child knew that sorrel was excellent for quenching thirst and that plantain healed scraped knees. Wild nature was both an enemy and a free pharmacy and grocery store for humans. Be honest with yourself. Do you think you could survive even 1 month on such a harsh diet? Imagine that you need not only to exist, but also to conserve your strength for exhausting hard work from dawn to dusk. You would have to build a house with your own hands, cut down centuries-old trees, and plow rocky virgin soil, and all this with a constant vitamin deficiency and monotonous, coarse food. Or are you more interested in learning how the first cities were built in the middle of a scorching desert without any construction equipment? It was a real battle between carpenters and engineers against nature and time itself. We can analyze how a real metropolis grew out of a dirty tent camp in just a couple of years. Write your choice under the video, and we will shoot a video on the most popular topic. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel right now to become part of our community. We do this work so that you don't miss out on new deep dives into real, unscripted history. Here, we tell only the truth about the past, no matter how shocking it may be. Stay with us because there is still so much unknown and interesting ahead.